Hey everyone, this is Jim, host of Simple Christianity. Today we're covering episode 3, where we're going to talk about the reliability of the New Testament. So if you have lived any amount of time, or in any kind of Christian circle, or anywhere where Christianity is anywhere close to popular or common, you have likely heard someone say the statement, or maybe thought it yourself, as I did when I was an atheist. I don't trust the Bible. With it being translated over and over and retranslated over the last 2,000 years, who knows what information in there can be trusted? Who knows how accurate it is? It can't be, with how much it's been changed hands over thousands of years, right? So we've all heard somebody say that, or like I said, we thought that ourselves. And essentially the biggest critique from a historical standpoint that the Bible is confronted with is being essentially accused of the telephone game being played. So if you're not familiar with the telephone game, so that was a game as a kid that I grew up with. If you're older than me or around my age, early 30s, then you probably grew up playing this game as well. It was great when you had a large group of people, when you had the bigger the better, because it made it more fun and more interesting. But telephone game essentially is, you start on one side and you have person number one, and they come up with a phrase or something that they want to say, and then they whisper it into the ear of person number two, to the point where person number three can't hear what they're saying. And so it's that person's job now to turn around and communicate that phrase that they just heard exactly as they heard it to the next person, and the next person, and the next person, and the next person, until you get to the very end. And then the test is, if the person at the very end can stand up and tell person number one, hey, you said, such and such, then person number one should be able to say, yeah, that's right, or nope, that's wrong. And it was always a fun illustration of how it was really, really hard, whether it was just resisting the temptation to change it, or really hard to hear and then communicate exactly what you just heard to somebody. It was really hard for the message from person number one to the last person to be consistent. And so that, again, that's kind of in an illustrative fashion. That's what the Bible gets accused of with all the translations and retranslations. And if the Bible was really constantly getting tweaked and changed, and over the 1,000 to 2,000 years that roughly that the scriptures have existed, New Testament documents at least, then that would be a big problem as a Christian. We wouldn't be able to trust what the Bible said. If it's been tweaked, who knows what's been changed? Who knows what's been doctored or edited? And so if that was the case, if that's how things were moved forward, then the atheist or the person, the non-Christian who's just critiquing the reliability of the Bible, they'd have a very strong leg to stand on. However, that's not how we get Bible translations today. That's not how we do that. That's not the process that we follow, or that we've ever followed. The process that we have always followed from the first point when we were taking things from the original languages to turn around and put it in a new one, or compile everything together into a single book like the Bible eventually was. The process that people follow is you get a committee of people who understand the history, the culture, and the language of either the Old Testament, you're talking about ancient Hebrew, or the New Testament, talking about ancient Greek. Okay, and these scholars, these experts in these fields, would have to come together, and they would read the original text, and then they would agree upon, let's say they're translating it into English, okay? They agree upon, yeah, that's what this verse says, that's what it says, yep, from ancient Hebrew, that's the best way to translate into that into English, okay, boom, and they write it. And they would follow that process every verse. It took a long time, okay? Understandably, you have to go through 66 books. It's a lot of text, right? And you're doing it in the original language, and you're having discussion. Somebody says, well, I think it means this, and that one person says, I think it means that. Well, now you got to talk and hash it out and say, well, what is the most appropriate? And at the end of this process, you come up with the Word of God, the ancient Hebrew or the ancient Greek being translated into a new language, okay, and the same meaning being brought forth. So it's not been changed in any real meaningful way, other than the fact that the language changed, or maybe the way that the language says it was altered to be more poetic, or more easy to understand, or more exact, or more precise, right? There's different ways that people approach translations, but the core meaning is still there. So nothing changes. But the most important part of that, again, is like I said, that root system. So you imagine like a tree, right? That trunk is still there. So we may have come off and we may have changed these little things here and there, but none of them affect the doctrine. None of them are any real meaningful changes, just again a taste, you could say. Maybe a different purpose behind the translation. But the core text is still here, the meaning's not lost, doctrine doesn't get changed. That's how we bring about a new translation. So the misunderstanding of how Bibles are translated and retranslated is something that I think a Christian would be well served in understanding and being able to turn around and repeat it, at least with some kind of level of good service, so that way that myth can start getting dispelled quickly, because it's not doing us any favors as Christians. And ultimately, when you take that into account and compare the Bible and its historical details, as far as about the Bible, not details contained within, but the number of copies that we have, when it was written, and compared to other contemporary historical texts, you actually can walk away with the fact that the Bible is one of the most reliable historical texts of its day. And so that may sound kind of outlandish or kind of strange for somebody if you're hearing that for the first time, but we'll walk through some illustrations, okay? Let's look at some other contemporary, historical, ancient texts that we consider to be reliable information that we turn and use, and in some cases we teach them in high schools, we teach them in universities, or they're reading material for some of those different places. And we can start with Homer's Iliad, okay? We all have known Homer's Iliad, the Odyssey, okay? We know these stories, they're a lot of fun. There's a lot of movies and TV shows and series that are out there to illustrate this. Some of them pretty old, some quite new. The books out there are kind of fun if you're able to read a version of the Iliad, okay? Well, the Iliad was a spoken poem for many hundreds, if not more than 1,000 years before it was ever written down. So you don't have text to go back to at all with that before 700 to 750 BC. Okay, so that's kind of striking. Now, that doesn't really do much inherently to affect the credibility of the story, because just think about it. In order to have received a coherent story today, there needs to be elements of it that are retained, even if you're just doing it orally, right? Just reciting a poem, a song of sorts to people, and that's how you're telling people about this story. Even if that's all you're doing, you need to be able to maintain certain level of consistency with it to be able to tell a coherent story. Okay, so like I said, it may sound crazy that we would think that that's some kind of reliable way to receive this information. It's not the best, especially for such a long period of time, but it is not considered a major knock against it to the point where we would not consider that a reliable way to communicate the information. And like I said, eventually it was written down, 700 to 750 BC or BCE. I don't really care. I don't really get into the drama around what people call the different eras, BC, BCE, AD, CE. It doesn't matter. Time was still split the same time for the same reason. So you can call it whatever you like. The facts are still the facts. That time is split at the birth of Jesus. So regardless of what you call it, if you want to try to omit Jesus from that, that's somebody else's problem, not mine. I don't care. But getting back to things. So we have 1,000 copies roughly of this text, oral tradition, oral poem for many hundreds of years, maybe over 1,000 years before it was finally written down. And it's considered to be a reliable historical text documenting the Greek war against the city of Troy. Okay. You can go to Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars. Okay. So Julius Caesar, who's a dictator of Rome, eventually becomes emperor, the first emperor of Rome. He died in 44 BC, I believe, somewhere in that time. So sometime in the late 40s BC, right? So you go back, gets higher, and it goes earlier back and further back in time. Sometime in there, he ran a campaign in France, in Gaul, and conquered what is known today as modern day France. Okay, conquered everything. The accounts for Julius Caesar's Gallic wars, were not written down until 900 years after the event. Hear that again. The account for Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars were not written down until about 900 years after the events. And we have about 9 or 10 copies, 9 or 10 sources to be able to go to Again, this is college level, university level material. You can read this, and it's in some places required reading depending on your major. University level text. It's still considered reliable. I'm not knocking it, saying it shouldn't be reliable. It is. It's considered to be reliable. Okay? Moving on. Life of Alexander the Great. Okay? Those of you who don't know, Alexander the Great was one of the greatest generals in all of human history. It was he leading the Greeks who ended up conquering much of what ended up being the Roman Empire. And when the Greek Empire collapsed, it created a void that the Roman Empire then filled. So they essentially laid the foundation for the Roman Empire. Okay? So Alexander the Great, again, one of the greatest military minds in the history of humanity. Okay? His life and his account of his life was written between 300 to 450 years after he died. Okay? We got 5 sources. 5 sources for his life. Again, the life of Alexander the Great is not considered to be a place filled with question marks. The text that we have, the narrative that we have, is considered to be a reliable, coherent story. Okay. Last one we'll bring up is the life of Tiberius Caesar. Now, the reason I bring up Tiberius Caesar is because he was a contemporary of Jesus. Okay, Tiberius Caesar died about 4 years after Jesus died, resurrected, and ascended into heaven. Okay, so the fact that this person lives at roughly the same time that Jesus did and dies at a very near time to Jesus' death, burial, resurrection, and ascension, that's very good for us to be able to use as a one-to-one comparison, right? So again, dies about 4 years after Jesus. The most reliable source for the life of Tiberius Caesar wrote his account between 120 and 180 years after he died. Now, this is not the earliest source, so I just want to be really clear. I'm not trying to pull any wool over anyone's eyes. There are earlier sources. They're not considered to be anywhere close to reliable or as reliable as his best source. And like I said, his best source, 120 to 180 years after Tiberius Caesar dies. Okay? Got 10 copies, 10 sources that we can look to. Okay? So these are contemporary historical ancient texts that are considered to be reliable accounts of history. Some of them contain miracles, okay? Some of them are written long after the event. And in most cases, we only have a handful of sources, okay? And these are some of the things that people might look to and say, okay, well, does it contain miracles? Oh, well, it's not reliable. No, most Greco-Roman historical sources do contain miracles, and that's not an exclusionary factor, okay? If it's written way after the events, oh, that's not reliable anymore. No, historically speaking, that is not an exclusionary factor. Like I said, we have, in the case of Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, those accounts were written 900 years after the events. Life of Alexander the Great, 300 to 450 years after the events. Okay? The Iliad, written many hundreds, maybe over 1,000 years after it was a spoken poem. Okay? So the events were probably at least, let's say on the low end, 1,500 years separated from the events to where the point it got written down. Okay? So, and I'm not setting you up for like, okay, the Bible's going to be right in that area, okay? I just want you to know where we're at, okay? So where does the Bible stand? Where's the New Testament at? Well, the latest gospel, written by John, scholars think it was written somewhere between 90 and 100 AD. Okay, that was the latest one. So Jesus died, and we think somewhere between 30 to 33 AD. Okay, so we're talking 60 to 70 years after the event. This is the latest gospel. Okay, Mark, the earliest gospel was written around 70 AD. So in all likelihood, less than 40 years separated from the event. You have a description of the life of Jesus. Okay, 40 years. Let me put that into perspective for you. I, as a grown man today, could have been born at about the same time Jesus was at this point, lived. Okay, Jesus died at about 33 years old. I'm 32. So if I'm born about the same time he is, okay, I could have lived up next beside him, watched his ministry, watched him get crucified, die, resurrect, and ascend into heaven. And before I was gone, 70 years old, I'm seeing somebody write down an account and that's starting to get distributed to my area. That's something none of these other historical texts can claim. At least not in a reliable way, like I said with the life of Tiberius Caesar. He had earlier sources, but not considered in any way reliable. None of these other texts, historically reliable texts, can claim they've got an eyewitness to the events, writing so soon to the event. So it sounds like the New Testament's got a leg up on the competition already. So let's go to number of sources. Remember, some of these, just very few. Life of Alexander the Great, 5 sources. 2 of the others, about 10 sources. And then the best one so far was Homer's Iliad, 1,000 copies. Okay, so where's the New Testament stand? Just the New Testament documents. If you look on the conservative end, 24,000 examples of letters, books, pages of letters, pages of books. And if you start including the fragments of pages, fragments of text that we're able to recover and say you got a corner of it just torn off and there's some words in here and we're able to see that, or maybe just a bottom portion of a page, think of whatever examples of a fragment, right? What that could mean. You include those, you're talking 30,000+ examples that we can look to and compare. What does this say versus what was historically written a few years after the event, hundreds of years after the event, over 1,000, 1,500 years after the event. We can look and see what that says and compare that to what we can have available to us today. And when we look at it, you might think, okay, wow, 24 to 30,000+ examples, all handwritten, mind you. There's got to be some differences. And there is. There's some differences. If I were to take all those texts, all those historical texts, and I compare that to what I have in my hands, there is roughly a 98.33% to a 99.75% agreement with what's available to us today. 98.33 to 99.75% agreement. It's that consistent. Okay, we're not talking about 98% different. We're talking about 98% the same. 98.33% the same as what we have available to us today. Okay, so what's that difference? What's that quarter difference to 1 2/3 different, or 1 2/3% difference? What is that? Okay, you're talking about pronouns getting swapped out. Someone gets called a he rather than a she. And there's some texts that say he, some say she. Okay, maybe there's more that say he, so we assume it's a he. There's articles left out or included, a, the, stuff like that, added in or removed when one has it and the other one doesn't. Most importantly, you talk about spelling, grammar errors. Track with me here. If I send you a text, okay, and I say, it's such a nice day out today, okay, and I misspell the word day and I put an O in place of the A in day, okay, and I say, I'm sorry, I messed that one up, let me try again, and I text you again, and I say, it's such a nice day out today, and this time I spelled day correctly, but I dropped the I off of the word nice. I say, sorry, one more time. It's such a nice day out today. And this time I spell it's without, and I leave out the apostrophe. I spell nice correctly. I spell day correctly. But when I say it's such a nice day out today, maybe I added an extra H at the end of the word such. Finally, I just text you again, you know what? I give up. I'm not doing it anymore. You know what I mean, okay? Each one of those sentences, there was an error and a difference between each 3, okay? Each one of them, okay? But you know what the meaning is. And a lot of it, when you start getting down to that 98.33%, the low end, right? When you get down to the low end, that's when you're including stuff like that. But let's say, let's take a super conservative, ultra critical approach towards textual criticism and make sure that anything anywhere close, if there is any even minute difference between one text or another, let's just take it out of the Bible. Every word, every sentence, every verse, anything. If it's got an issue, let's throw it out. What are we left with? You're left with 98.33% of the Bible. Okay, so you dropped about a 1 2/3%, but you've left out no critical doctrine to Christian belief. So when you're thinking about, okay, well, when you take all that stuff out and how reliable is the information that is consistent, let's just stick to that, you're still left with every critical piece of Christian doctrine. So if you're asking the question, can the Bible be trusted? If you're asking the question, is the Bible communicating reliable information throughout the course of time? Is that information staying the same? The answer is yes, emphatically so. In fact, I don't know of another historical text, another contemporary historical text, that is doing a better job of communicating the same consistent message, handwritten, mind you, throughout all the course of time, like the Bible does. So if you're asking the question, can you rely on the Bible and the information it shares? You can. You can. In fact, and I'll end on this. There's an atheist named Bart Ehrman. He's a historian, professional historian. He takes to the debate stage to argue for people against the Christian faith. Okay, not a Christian. Tries to convince people to not be a Christian. Okay. He himself, being a professional historian, knows the Bible's reliable, and he spends much of his time actually arguing against other atheists and correcting them and letting them know when they try to say, oh, the Bible can't be trusted, it's not a reliable historical text. And his rebuttal, consistent rebuttal, is always, actually it is. But he has other objections. He thinks that, and I've heard this in a debate, he thinks that the early church had a joint hallucination for over a month, and that they hallucinated Jesus coming back from the dead, walking around for 40 days, and then ascending into heaven. You know, there's hundreds of people that Jesus met in that time frame, and he thinks the most logical explanation for why you should not be a Christian is not that these people were lying or that the text is unreliable, but that the people had a joint hallucination, and that hallucination was of Jesus resurrecting and walking around and then ascending into heaven. I don't know about you, but I think it's probably a bit more, believable to just believe what the Bible is saying versus posit that hundreds of people for over a month had a joint hallucination of a resurrected and ascended Jesus. But that's for you to decide and deal with, and I will leave it at that. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I enjoyed putting it together. This is some of my most favorite information to share regarding the reliability of the gospel, and in my opinion, one of the strongest arguments for why you should be a Christian. So if you enjoyed it, then hit like on the video, comment below, let me know your feedback, whether you liked it, disliked it, you have some critiques, or if you have questions, I'd love to hear from you. Share it with friends, family, if you want to just talk about it, whether you agreed with everything I said or not, whether you liked it or not, share it with people, talk about it, get the conversation going. And be sure to just come back and engage and contribute to the community. So next time we're going to be doing episode 4. We're going to talk about how prophecy actually reinforces the reliability of the Bible and proves the character of Jesus. Have a great evening, everyone. God bless.